The distress signal that changed everything started as nothing more than crackling noise cutting through frequencies that most advanced civilizations had stopped using a long time ago. The Federation of Peaceful Worlds had better technology now, systems that could send messages instantly across huge distances using something called quantum communication. These systems were fast, clear, and reliable, which meant the old radio frequencies were basically forgotten, left behind like outdated tools nobody needed anymore. But when the VRYNN colony on Sanctuary Prime suddenly found itself being attacked, those fancy quantum systems stopped working almost immediately. The creatures attacking them, the Krelvik, had brought special jamming equipment that shut down all the advanced communications within the first few minutes of their invasion. The colonists were left scrambling desperately to find any way at all to call for help before it was too late. Telvin Mora had never thought of himself as anyone special or particularly brave. He was just a maintenance engineer, someone who had spent the last 40 years of his life making sure the colony's water purification systems kept running properly. It was quiet work, predictable work, the kind of peaceful existence that his entire species had evolved to appreciate and prefer. The VRYNN came from what the galaxy classified as a garden world, a planet so gentle and safe that the most dangerous animal living there was about as threatening as a squirrel on Earth. Because their home world was so peaceful, the VRYNN had never developed any natural weapons or aggressive instincts. Instead, they evolved intelligence and the ability to cooperate smoothly with each other. Violence was something completely foreign to their nature, something they had never needed to understand or practice. So when the massive Krelvik bioships suddenly appeared in orbit above Sanctuary Prime and immediately started attacking, Telvin could only stand there and watch in growing horror as the colony's minimal defense systems were destroyed before anyone could even figure out what was happening. The Krelvik were a parasitic species, organisms that survived by consuming other civilizations entirely. They had spent millions of years perfecting their methods, learning exactly how to overwhelm peaceful societies before those societies could mount any kind of organized resistance. They were efficient, ruthless, and completely unstoppable once they committed to an attack. Their ships were not made of metal and machinery like most spacecraft. Instead, they were living creatures, massive biological entities that could travel through space and carry thousands of smaller attack organisms inside them. When they wanted to harvest a planet, they would land these attack organisms on the surface and begin systematically consuming everything, turning the biomass of an entire civilization into fuel for their continued expansion across the galaxy. As Telvin watched buildings throughout the colony start burning, as he heard the screams of his neighbors echoing through streets that had never known violence before, something from his childhood suddenly came back to him. His grandfather had been an amateur historian, someone who collected information about old technologies from the early days when the VRYNN first started exploring space. Most people thought his grandfather's hobby was a waste of time, just an old man obsessing over outdated equipment that nobody used anymore. But among all those forgotten pieces of knowledge was detailed information about how to build a simple radio transmitter, the kind of device that sent signals through space using electromagnetic waves instead of quantum entanglement. It was primitive technology, so old-fashioned that modern engineers never bothered learning about it because they would never need to use it in their careers. Telvin made a decision in that moment. He abandoned his home, leaving behind everything he owned, and ran through smoke-filled streets toward the colony's main communications center. The building was partially damaged already, with fires burning in some sections, but Telvin managed to get inside and make his way to the storage rooms where old equipment sat covered in dust. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely pick up the components he needed. Tears were streaming down his face because he could hear people dying outside, could hear the screams getting closer as the Krelvik systematically worked their way through the colony. But he forced himself to focus on what his grandfather had taught him all those years ago. He found spare parts, old circuit boards, pieces of wire and metal that had been sitting unused for decades. Working purely from memory, with his hands trembling and his heart pounding, he assembled a makeshift radio transmitter. When he finally got the device working and heard the crackle of active transmission, Telvin started broadcasting. He sent out the same message over and over on every frequency the transmitter could reach. The message was simple and heartbreaking in its directness. Sanctuary Prime was under attack by Krelvik forces. The colony held 3 million inhabitants who had no weapons and no way to defend themselves. The nearest Federation military fleet was 14 days away according to their calculations, and intelligence estimates suggested the Krelvik would finish harvesting everyone within 72 hours. Telvin broadcast the exact coordinates of the colony, described the enemy forces as best he could based on the limited information reaching the communications center, and included a desperate plea for anyone receiving the transmission to forward it immediately to Federation military command. He did not really expect anyone to respond directly to his broadcast. The old radio frequencies were only monitored by a handful of hobbyists and historians scattered across the entire galaxy, people who maintained the equipment more out of nostalgia than any practical purpose. But Telvin was a father. His 2 young children were hiding somewhere in the colony, terrified and vulnerable, and he would try absolutely anything if it gave even the smallest chance of saving their lives. So he kept broadcasting, kept sending that same desperate message out into space, hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, might hear it and decide to help. What Telvin could not possibly know, what nobody in the colony understood, was that humanity had only recently made contact with the wider galactic community. Humans were newcomers, a species that had just figured out faster-than-light travel and was still learning how everything worked in galactic society. When human diplomats first arrived at Federation headquarters and started setting up their embassy, they made a request that confused all the other species. They asked for access to all known communication frequencies, including the ones that had been obsolete for thousands of years. The Federation liaisons could not understand why anyone would want information about such outdated technology. Ambassador Patricia Hayes had smiled at their confusion and explained that humans believed in maintaining backup systems for everything important. You never knew when old technology might suddenly become useful again, and besides, human amateur radio enthusiasts back on Earth would be fascinated to explore these new frequencies and talk to any aliens who might still be using them. That decision, made months earlier for reasons that seemed almost trivial at the time, would end up saving 3 million lives. Because when Telvin started broadcasting his desperate plea, there was actually someone listening. Within 6 hours of Derek Thompson sending his emergency report to Terran Defense Force headquarters, humanity had put together a military response that would have seemed absolutely impossible to anyone familiar with how the Federation normally did things. 3 destroyers, 2 frigates, and 1 marine assault carrier called Hammer of Terror were immediately pulled from whatever they were doing and ordered to head towards Sanctuary Prime as fast as their engines could safely take them. The order came directly from Admiral Robert Stone, a tough veteran who had seen plenty of combat in his long career and now commanded all human military forces operating on the frontier edges of explored space. Stone had read through all the situation reports carefully, looked at the numbers, and made a decision that ignored all the normal procedures about consulting with diplomats and getting proper authorization through official channels. People were dying right now while he sat there reading reports. The Federation's own military fleet could not possibly arrive in time to save anyone. Humanity had ships available, humanity had trained soldiers ready to fight, and Stone believed humanity had a moral duty to help when innocent civilians were being slaughtered. Whatever political trouble came from his decision could be dealt with later, after they had saved as many lives as possible. The human warships heading towards Sanctuary Prime represented something new in galactic military affairs. They had been built using a mixture of human engineering ideas and various pieces of alien technology that Earth had gotten through diplomatic relationships and trade deals with other species. What made these ships unusual was not really their weapons or their shields, though both were certainly powerful enough to be taken seriously. What made them truly remarkable was something much more basic and fundamental. They were crewed entirely by humans, and that mattered because of where humans came from. Every major spacefaring civilization in the Federation had evolved on what scientists called garden worlds, planets where life was relatively easy and safe. On these worlds, evolution had been gentle. Survival had never required developing extreme physical abilities or aggressive instincts. The aliens who dominated galactic society came from comfortable places where the weather was predictable, the gravity was light, and the native animals were not particularly dangerous. Earth was completely different. When Federation xenobiologists first studied Earth and learned about its environment, they classified it as a Class 12 death world. That classification meant Earth was one of the most hostile planets to life that anyone had ever discovered. The scientists genuinely could not believe that intelligent creatures had somehow evolved there and survived long enough to build cities and develop technology. Everything about Earth seemed designed to kill whatever tried to live on its surface. The gravity was nearly twice as strong as what most aliens considered normal or comfortable. Spending extended time in Earth's gravity would exhaust most Federation species and could even cause permanent damage to their bodies. But humans had evolved in that crushing gravity, so their bones were incredibly dense and their muscles were naturally much stronger than aliens of similar size. The atmosphere itself was dangerous to many species. Earth's air contained oxygen at concentrations that other aliens found mildly toxic if they breathed it without filters for too long. Humans needed that oxygen-rich air to fuel their high metabolism bodies, but what was normal for them would slowly poison many of their galactic neighbors. The weather patterns on Earth were violent and unpredictable in ways that garden world species found genuinely terrifying. Hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, droughts, floods. All of these were regular occurrences that humans just learned to deal with as normal parts of life. Most alien homeworlds had stable, predictable weather that rarely threatened anyone. Earth's weather could kill you if you were not careful, and humans had spent thousands of years learning how to survive it. But the most disturbing thing about Earth, from an alien perspective, was the life that had evolved there. Every creature on Earth had been locked in a brutal evolutionary arms race for billions of years. Predators evolved better ways to hunt and kill. Prey evolved better ways to avoid being hunted and killed. The result was a planet filled with an incredible diversity of creatures equipped with fangs, claws, venom, armor, camouflage, and countless other adaptations designed specifically for violence. Some animals were ambush predators that could hide perfectly still for hours waiting to strike. Others were pursuit predators that could run for days chasing injured prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Some had venom potent enough to kill creatures many times their size. Others had jaws strong enough to crush bone. Humans had evolved right in the middle of all this violence. They were not the biggest or strongest or fastest creatures on their planet. They did not have natural weapons like claws or fangs. What they had instead was intelligence, the ability to cooperate in large groups, and the capacity to make and use tools. Humans survived on Earth by becoming better at organized violence than anything else on their planet. They learned to hunt in coordinated groups using weapons they crafted themselves. They learned to defend their communities from predators and rival human groups. They spent thousands upon thousands of years fighting each other in wars over resources and territory, and through all that conflict they developed an incredibly sophisticated understanding of how to wage war effectively. This history shaped everything about human biology and psychology in ways that made them fundamentally different from garden world species. Humans could survive injuries that would quickly kill most aliens. Their bodies had redundant systems and remarkable healing capabilities developed through millions of years of dangerous living. They could function under stress levels that would cause other species to shut down completely. Their brains were wired to stay calm and think clearly even in life-threatening situations because on Earth, panicking usually meant dying. Most disturbing to peaceful Federation species, humans had an inherent capacity for violence that was built into their nature. They could fight, they could kill, and they could organize themselves into incredibly effective military forces. The key difference was that humans had also developed strong moral and ethical frameworks for controlling that capacity for violence, using it only when they believed it was necessary and justified. Lieutenant Colonel Angela Price commanded the 1,200 Marines aboard Hammer of Terror, and she represented everything that made humans both fascinating and frightening to their alien neighbors. She had served in multiple combat zones back on Earth before humanity developed interstellar travel, seeing real warfare in 3 different regions and earning medals for exceptional courage under fire that she kept in a drawer and never displayed. She was not particularly tall even by human standards, but she had the kind of calm, intensely focused presence that marked professional soldiers everywhere. When Admiral Stone briefed her about Sanctuary Prime, she asked only 3 questions that revealed how she thought. How many civilians needed evacuation? What were the enemy's capabilities? And how much freedom did she have in deciding what level of force to use? Stone's answers were straightforward. 3 million VRYN needed saving, though 200,000 had already been killed. The Krelvik used biological ships and swarm tactics. And Price had complete authority to use whatever force she deemed necessary. Federation rules about proportional response did not apply because Earth had not actually signed those treaties yet. The human fleet made the journey in 4 days, pushing their engines harder than was technically safe and burning through fuel at rates that would horrify efficiency-focused Federation commanders. They arrived to find the situation even worse than reported. The Krelvik had established complete orbital control and were actively processing civilians on the surface below. When the human destroyers destroyed the Krelvik scouting group so quickly and completely, it triggered an immediate reaction from the main enemy force that was surrounding Sanctuary Prime. The Krelvik operated with something called a collective intelligence, which meant they did not think as individuals the way humans or other species did. Instead, they functioned more like a hive mind, with all the different bioships connected through biological signals that let them coordinate their actions. This collective intelligence was not particularly smart when it came to complex reasoning or creative problem-solving, but it had something else that made it dangerous. Through millions of years of evolution, the Krelvik had developed incredible pattern recognition abilities. They could instantly identify threats and respond to them using tactics that had proven successful over countless previous battles. The moment those scouting ships were destroyed, the collective intelligence recognized that these newcomers were not like the soft, peaceful Federation species it usually encountered. This was a real threat that needed to be eliminated immediately before the harvest operation could continue. 27 bioships detached themselves from their positions in orbit above the planet and started moving together into an attack formation. This was not a random grouping. The Krelvik had used this exact formation successfully against Federation defense fleets many times before across different star systems. The formation was specifically designed to do two important things at the same time. First, it allowed the bioships to provide defensive support to each other, with their biological shields overlapping to create stronger protection. Second, it meant they could attack from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming enemy point defense systems through sheer numbers and perfectly coordinated timing. Against most opponents, this tactic worked extremely well. Admiral Robert Stone sat in his command chair aboard the heavy cruiser Indomitable and watched the tactical display showing how the Krelvik were moving. A slight smile crossed his face as he observed their response developing exactly the way he had predicted it would. The swarm mentality that controlled Krelvik decision-making made them brutally effective against enemies who were disorganized, unprepared, or too cautious in their responses. But that same swarm mentality also made them predictable to anyone who understood their evolutionary psychology and how their collective decision-making actually worked. The Krelvik could not think creatively or adapt to genuinely new situations. They did what had worked before, following patterns that were essentially hardwired into their biology through millions of years of successful evolution. Stone opened a direct communication channel that connected him to every single ship in his small fleet. His voice was calm and steady as he issued the orders that would begin the real battle. What he was about to show the Krelvik, and anyone else watching, was something that Federation military forces had gradually forgotten over thousands of years of peace and comfort. The Federation approached warfare cautiously and carefully. They believed in measured responses, in using only the minimum force necessary, in giving enemies chances to surrender before destroying them. This philosophy came from the fact that Federation species were peaceful by nature and found violence deeply uncomfortable. They fought when they absolutely had to, but they tried to minimize the violence as much as possible. Humans saw things differently. Humans came from a planet where hesitation meant death, where giving your enemy time to recover was usually a fatal mistake. Human military philosophy, developed through thousands of years of warfare against other humans, taught that when you committed to battle, you committed completely. You did not hold back. You did not give the enemy time to adapt or recover. You hit them with everything you had, as hard as you could, as fast as possible, and you kept hitting them until they could not fight back anymore. This was not cruelty or bloodthirstiness. It was practical military thinking based on hard experience. Overwhelming force applied decisively saved lives in the long run by ending conflicts quickly before they could drag on and cause more casualties on both sides. The human fleet formation looked completely wrong to anyone trained in Federation naval tactics. Instead of spreading out to maintain safe distances between ships, the human vessels had grouped themselves together in a tight cluster. The three destroyers named Defiant, Relentless, and Vigilant formed the front line of the formation. Behind them came the two frigates, Steadfast and Guardian, positioned to provide supporting fire. The marine carrier Hammer of Terror held position at the back with all its weapons armed and ready but not yet firing. To a Federation tactical officer, this formation would look dangerously vulnerable. The ships were close enough together that a single well-placed attack could potentially damage multiple vessels. They were practically inviting the enemy to concentrate fire on them. The Krelvik collective saw those apparent weaknesses and adjusted their approach to exploit them. The bioships began moving to surround the human formation from multiple angles, preparing to attack from different directions simultaneously. This was exactly what their tactical programming told them to do when facing a clustered enemy formation. They were following the patterns that had worked successfully for millions of years of evolution and thousands of successful conquests. What they did not understand, what they could not understand because their collective intelligence lacked the flexibility for truly creative thinking, was that the humans were deliberately baiting them into this exact response. Then the human ships moved, and the Krelvik learned what humans really meant when they talked about aggressive maneuver warfare. The three destroyers in front did not wait for the enemy to come to them like Federation ships would have done. They did not maintain their defensive positions and let the Krelvik close to optimal firing range at their own pace. Instead, those three destroyers suddenly accelerated directly toward the approaching enemy swarm at velocities that pushed their engines to absolute maximum capacity. The forces involved were incredible. Inside those ships, human crews were being pressed into their specially designed acceleration couches by forces that would have killed most alien species outright. Their inertial dampening systems were working at maximum power just to keep those forces at survivable levels. Most Federation species would have blacked out or died from the acceleration alone, but humans had evolved in Earth's crushing gravity. Their bodies were built to handle extreme physical stress. The destroyers closed the distance between themselves and the Krelvik formation in a fraction of the time the enemy had calculated. Before the bioships could adjust their positions or revise their tactical approach, the human ships opened fire with every weapon they had while still accelerating at full power. The effect was devastating. Railguns fired solid tungsten projectiles accelerated to incredible speeds by electromagnetic force. These were not energy weapons that could be absorbed or deflected by shields. These were physical objects with enormous mass moving at tremendous velocity, and the kinetic energy they carried was absolutely massive. When those projectiles hit the Krelvik bioships, they punched straight through the organic hulls like they were made of paper. The biology that made the bioships flexible and self-healing could not cope with this kind of brutal physical trauma. Ships simply exploded as the penetrators ripped through vital internal structures. But the railgun barrage was just the opening move in a coordinated attack that had been carefully planned. While the destroyers tore through the center of the Krelvik formation, drawing all the enemy attention toward themselves, the two frigates launched massive volleys of missiles. The Krelvik had been so focused on the immediate threat of the charging destroyers that they had not even detected these missiles being launched from further back. These were not the sophisticated guided missiles that Federation forces typically used, weapons with advanced artificial intelligence that could make complex decisions independently. Human missiles were much simpler and more direct. They were fast, they were tough enough to survive point defense fire, and when they reached their targets, they exploded with nuclear warheads that humans had spent centuries perfecting. The nuclear detonations rippled through the Krelvik formation in rapid succession. The bioships were resistant to many types of damage because of their organic construction and biological healing capabilities, but they had absolutely no defense against the fundamental physics of nuclear explosions and the intense radiation that came with them. The drop pods fell through Sanctuary Prime's atmosphere like burning meteors streaking across the sky, their outer surfaces glowing white-hot from the intense friction of atmospheric entry. These pods were not designed for comfort or elegance. They were designed for one specific purpose: to get Marines from orbit to ground as quickly as possible while keeping them alive during the descent. The outer layers of each pod were made from ablative materials, special heat shields that were meant to burn away in a controlled manner, carrying the tremendous heat away from the pod's interior as they vaporized. Inside each cramped pod, a single Marine hung suspended within their powered armor suit, strapped into a harness that would keep them secure during the violent descent and even more violent landing that was coming. Lieutenant Colonel Angela Price had made combat drops before, but the feeling never became routine or comfortable. She hung in her armor inside her pod, monitoring the constant stream of information displayed on her helmet's heads-up display. Her heart was beating faster than normal, and she could feel the familiar tight knot of anxiety in her stomach that always appeared in the minutes before combat actually began. But these were not new sensations to her, and she had learned years ago how to recognize these feelings and channel them into something useful. Fear could make you hesitate and get you killed, but if you acknowledged it and controlled it, that same nervous energy could sharpen your focus and speed up your reaction time. The display in front of her eyes showed the ground rushing up toward her at terrifying speed. She could see the exact coordinates of their landing zone, the spot where Telvin Mora had been broadcasting from, where intelligence reports said hundreds of civilians were trapped and waiting to be rescued or killed. The intelligence brief had been clear about what they would be facing when they hit the ground. The Krelvik had extremely heavy forces throughout the entire area. Their processing organisms, massive biological creatures that existed solely to consume other life forms and convert them into usable biomass, were actively working in multiple locations. They were systematically harvesting the VRYNN civilians, and every minute that passed meant more innocent people were being killed. The mission orders that Price had given to her Marines were simple and direct because complicated plans tended to fall apart the moment actual combat started. Get to the ground. Secure any survivors you can find. Get them to the extraction points where transport ships would be waiting. And kill anything that tried to stop you from accomplishing those objectives. There were no restrictions on weapons use, no requirements to attempt communication with the enemy, no complicated rules of engagement to remember. This was as straightforward as military operations could get. The pods hit the ground with impacts that would have killed unprotected humans instantly. The force of landing was tremendous, like being in a car crash except the crash was deliberate and controlled. But the powered armor suits the Marines wore were designed specifically to handle this kind of punishment. Sophisticated shock absorption systems built into the armor distributed the impact forces across the entire suit, and the Marines inside were strapped into harnesses that kept their bodies from being thrown around. There was still a jarring sensation, a moment where everything shook violently, but it was survivable. The moment the pods registered ground contact, explosive bolts fired automatically, blowing the heavy doors off their hinges and opening the pods to the outside environment. Alpha Company emerged from their pods directly into a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The communications center plaza had been transformed into what could only be described as a feeding ground. Massive Krelvik processing organisms dominated the area, creatures so large and so alien that the human mind struggled to fully process what it was seeing. They looked like something created by combining the worst aspects of insects and fungus, biological horrors that existed only to consume and convert. These creatures were in the process of systematically eating VRYNN civilians, pulling them into openings in their bodies where biological processes broke down the victims and converted their organic matter into nutrients that the Krelvik could use to grow more of themselves. Smaller Krelvik organisms, roughly the size of large dogs but moving on multiple segmented legs, were patrolling the perimeter and herding terrified VRYNN toward the processes. The air itself was wrong, filled with smells that human noses had never encountered before, chemical compounds that the Krelvik naturally produced as part of their biological functions mixed with the stench of death and decay. Price opened fire before her boots had fully settled on the ground. Her plasma rifle, a weapon that used magnetic fields to contain and project superheated matter, sent bolts of energy into the nearest processing organism. The plasma was hot enough to ignite almost anything organic on contact, and the massive creature erupted into flames as its biological compounds caught fire. The creature's screaming was unlike anything the Marines had heard before, a sound that operated on frequencies that made human teeth ache and triggered instinctive disgust responses deep in the brain. But that dying scream accomplished something important. It alerted every Krelvik organism in the plaza that something was attacking them. The response was immediate and aggressive. The smaller Krelvik warriors, the organisms that served as the equivalent of infantry soldiers, turned and swarmed toward the humans with frightening speed. These creatures had evolved for exactly this purpose, to defend the processes and eliminate threats to the harvest operation. They moved on multiple legs that let them navigate any terrain easily, and they were armed with biological weapons that ranged from organs that could spray highly corrosive acid to hardened bone spurs that could punch through conventional armor plating. They were fast, they were aggressive, and they showed absolutely no fear of death because fear was not something their collective intelligence had evolved to feel. Individual Krelvik organisms were expendable components of a larger whole. Losing a few dozen or even a few hundred warriors meant nothing as long as the processes survived to continue harvesting. But the Krelvik had never encountered anything like humans before, and they had certainly never faced human Marines in powered armor. Alpha Company responded to the attack with the kind of smooth coordination that only came from months of intensive training together. Without anyone needing to give orders, the Marines automatically moved into positions that created overlapping fields of fire, areas where multiple soldiers could shoot at the same targets from different angles. The powered armor absorbed the initial Krelvik assault without any Marine taking serious damage. The acid that the Krelvik sprayed was certainly dangerous and could eat through normal materials easily, but the armor had been designed with multiple layers specifically to handle chemical attacks. The outer layer would be damaged or destroyed, but there were more layers underneath. The bone spurs that could punch through conventional armor simply bounced off or got stuck in the thick composite plating that covered every vital area of the suits. And then the Marines started systematically destroying everything that was attacking them. The Krelvik warriors were strong and their weapons were legitimately dangerous, but they had evolved to prey on peaceful species that did not fight back effectively. They had never encountered a species that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of organized violence. The plasma rifles cut through Krelvik organisms like they were made of paper. The grenade launchers that many Marines carried sent explosive rounds into clusters of enemies, and each detonation would take out multiple targets. The Marines moved through the plaza like a precision machine designed for killing, and the Krelvik had no answer for it. The political storm that followed humanity's military intervention at Sanctuary Prime started about 6 hours after the last transport ship left the planet carrying rescued VRYNN civilians. Within hours of the evacuation being completed, the Federation Council called an emergency session to discuss what had just happened. This was not a routine meeting. Emergency sessions were only called when something serious had occurred that threatened the stability or principles of the entire Federation. Representatives from dozens of member species gathered in the Great Council chamber, and the atmosphere was tense from the very beginning. Many of the alien diplomats were clearly angry or disturbed by what humanity had done, though they expressed these emotions in different ways depending on their cultural backgrounds. Ambassador Patricia Hayes stood before the full assembly representing humanity, and she could see the range of reactions on the faces looking back at her. Some representatives showed barely controlled outrage, their alien features twisted in expressions that communicated anger even across species barriers. Others looked frightened, which was perhaps even more concerning than the anger. They were afraid of what humanity represented, afraid of what it meant that Deathworlders had just demonstrated such overwhelming military capability. The one notable exception to all this negativity was the VRYNN delegation. They had sent their most senior and respected diplomat, and he was not there to complain. He was there specifically to thank humanity for saving his entire species from annihilation. But his voice of gratitude was drowned out by the concerns and complaints coming from other member species who had very different perspectives on what had happened. The primary complaint that kept coming up, the issue that nearly every species seemed to agree on, was that humanity had used grossly excessive military force. The Krelvik swarm that had been attacking Sanctuary Prime no longer existed. It had been completely destroyed with no survivors. Every single bioship had been either obliterated in combat or had fled the system so badly damaged that intelligence reports suggested most would not survive the journey back to Krelvik-controlled space. Human forces had not attempted any communication with the Krelvik before attacking. They had not tried negotiation or offered the enemy a chance to surrender. They had simply arrived and started killing with ruthless efficiency until the threat was eliminated. To Federation species who valued careful measured responses and always attempted diplomatic solutions before resorting to violence, this approach seemed shockingly brutal and unnecessary. The weapons humanity had used were another major source of concern. The Federation had moved beyond nuclear weapons thousands of years ago, viewing them as primitive and unnecessarily destructive. Most advanced civilizations used energy weapons that could be precisely controlled and that did not leave lasting environmental contamination. Humans had deployed nuclear missiles during the orbital battle, weapons that released radiation and caused effects that would persist in the space around Sanctuary Prime for years. The kinetic weapons were equally troubling to Federation sensibilities. Railguns that fired solid projectiles at tremendous speed seemed crude and wasteful compared to elegant energy weapons. The fact that these primitive weapons had proven devastatingly effective made them even more disturbing because it suggested that technological sophistication was not as important as the Federation had always believed. Several council members stood to speak about the dangerous precedent this intervention set. The Federation had maintained peace among its member species for thousands of years through a carefully constructed system of rules, protocols, and diplomatic procedures. Military action was always supposed to be a last resort, employed only after exhaustive diplomatic efforts had failed and only with proper authorization from the Council. Individual species were not supposed to unilaterally decide to intervene in conflicts, even when civilians were dying, because that kind of independent action could destabilize the entire system. If every species started making their own decisions about when military force was justified, the argument went, it would lead to chaos and potentially to conflicts between Federation members themselves. The careful balance of power that had kept peace for so long would collapse. Some of the more aggressive speakers suggested that humanity needed to face consequences for their actions. These were usually representatives from species that had historically been influential in Federation military policy and who now felt threatened by humanity's demonstration of capability. They proposed that humans should be restricted in their military activities, perhaps even required to submit their ship designs and weapons systems for Federation approval before deployment. A few extreme voices even suggested that Deathworld species like humans might need to be quarantined or at least heavily monitored to prevent them from disrupting galactic civilization with their violent tendencies. These suggestions were presented as reasonable security measures, but everyone in the chamber understood they were really about fear and the desire to control something that made comfortable civilizations very uncomfortable. Ambassador Hayes listened to hours of complaints and accusations before she was finally given permission to respond. When the council speaker indicated it was her turn to address the assembly, she stood and looked around at all the alien faces watching her. Her response would become one of the most famous speeches in human diplomatic history, quoted in schools and military academies for generations afterward. She began by acknowledging the concerns that had been raised, showing that she understood why many species were troubled by what had happened. But then she started asking questions that made many council members visibly uncomfortable. She pointed out that according to the Federation's own fleet deployment schedules, the nearest military response force would have arrived at Sanctuary Prime 11 days after humanity got there. She asked the Assembly to think carefully about what that timeline meant. Intelligence estimates had indicated the Krelvik would complete their harvest operation within 72 hours. That meant every single VRYNN on that planet, all 3 million of them, would have been consumed and converted into Krelvik biomass a full week before Federation forces arrived. The careful protocols and proper authorization procedures would have resulted in the complete extinction of an entire colony. Hayes let that sink in for a moment before continuing. She described what human forces had found when they arrived at Sanctuary Prime. The Krelvik were not threatening to harm civilians or using them as hostages in some kind of negotiation. They were actively processing them, systematically eating entire populations to fuel their expansion. This was not a situation where diplomatic communication might have resolved the conflict peacefully. The Krelvik did not negotiate. They consumed. Every hour that humanity had spent trying to communicate or requesting proper authorization would have resulted in thousands more deaths. Hayes asked the assembly a direct question. If following proper procedures meant that millions of innocent people died while committees debated appropriate responses, what exactly was the purpose of those procedures? What did Federation membership actually mean if it did not include a commitment to protect member species from extinction? Retriclord can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.